Greetings, adventurers, and welcome back to the Den of the Drake. Other dragons hoard gold, while I hoard internet cringe. There is no creature that retail and food service workers fear more than the Karen. Trust me, you've heard of these people before. The obnoxious, entitled caricature of a disgruntled customer who makes the lives of poor employees complete hell. Working a service job is almost a rite of passage in American culture, so of course most people have encountered these horrifying beasts before. When the Karen meme started getting popular on the internet, it was very relatable for the first few times. Then the next 100 were, okay, I guess still relatable. Then the next 1,000. And then the concept of a fucking Karen took over the internet, and then it just got annoying. Reading most of these Karen stories now just makes me roll my eyes. If they're not just blatant lies about a stereotypical middle-aged woman with a short trim blonde haircut, they're at least an embezzled retelling of a mundane event. It's kinda like what happened with neckbeard stories and entitled parents, where there were just so many fake stories telling practically the same event over and over, it completely destroyed any value the original meme might have had. Hell, this surplus of obviously fake Karen stories has turned me into somewhat of a Karen apologist. It's gotten to the point where if the waitress at Olive Garden were to get up on the table and take a literal shit in my spaghetti, I would be afraid to ask for the manager because I know the internet would be there to call me a Karen. But that is a long-winded rant for another time. This incredible surplus of Karen memes and stories is why I almost skipped over the story I have for you today. But then I started reading. Oh boy, does this one get spicy. Today's story revolves around a male player who uses manipulative tactics to truly earn the title of Karen. Now, without any further delay, let's go ahead and dive right into the horrifying world of r/RPG horror stories. Enjoy. This story is titled, Manipulative Karen Player Wants More. Not long ago, I wrote an epic 5-part story on this subreddit about my real-life trauma at the hands of manipulators, and how I used D&D to keep hope alive in my world. It caused some controversy, and was eventually read on YouTube, where it caused even more controversy. I didn't think I'd be writing here again so soon, because I didn't think I'd be fooled again. This is my 5th attempt to write down this story because it's still fresh, and I'm still dealing with the open wounds, the fallout, and the controversy. This is the story of the first, and hopefully last time, I will ever have to kick a player in all of my 21 years of DMing. Meet my players. Indy, the amateur archaeologist and cross-dressing paladin. Stabby, the sarcastic tabaxi swashbuckler. Bernie, the pyromaniac sorcerer. Kitty, the moon druid detective, and Sparkles, the subject of my story. This story covers over a year of gaming, so I'll try to keep it relatively brief. I blame myself. I saw the warning signs, but I figured since I was older, a confident and experienced DM, and a survivor of extensive manipulation, there was no way I could have been taken advantage of again, right? I figured that they were just young and finding their way. Every other problem player I had dealt with had turned around once they had realized that they are in a safe space, and don't have to fight against the DM, the game, and the other players. This was my turn to learn a lesson. I was naive in more ways than one. This was my first 5th edition game, and my signature style is to consider all rules as optional. I clearly saw Sparkles as the opposite kind of player. He knew all of the rules and used them all. I thought we would balance each other out, and while I could run a game with almost no rules as easily as breathing, I could also learn the ins and outs of 5th edition by having him around. Just so that there was no confusion, I was very clear about how I ran my game, and what I would and would not tolerate. The first thing I denounced was power gaming. So when he pitched his semi-homebrew paladin/divine soul sorcerer to me, Sparkles was explicit in claiming that it was all for roleplay purposes. I'm a big believer in letting people play the characters that they want, and I was a little too fresh on 5th edition to spot the dirty tricks. So, having literally just told him that I loathed power gaming, I trusted him. What I got was a spotlight-hogging, self-insert Mary Sue anime protagonist that had an AC of 27 at level 3. They tanked, they healed, and they hit harder than everyone. And they had every overpowered support spell in the game. Furthermore, every ability they claimed was just for roleplay purposes, synergized into being able to do anything they wanted, whenever they wanted, with no way in the game rules to stop them. Not satisfied with filling every party role, he started trying to be the DM. He would interrupt me anytime I tried to describe him doing anything, raising one finger like he was posing for a meme, and announce, "If I may." Then, without wanting to find out if he may, he would fully paraphrase everything I just said to make himself sound way cooler. Then he would just finish with, "I'm sorry, it's just really important to me that my character is very graceful. Okay, now you can continue." Before long, my players started coming to me with complaints, and I agreed with all of them. Indy in particular was quite vehement about how hard she worked to fulfill her paladin oaths. Meanwhile, Sparkles just acted like an angry teenager with a 10 p.m. bedtime every time he was expected to act like a paladin. He acted like his mentors, his oath, his church, and his gods were the polygamous helicopter parents who oppressed his free spirit. This was especially galling when I had been very clear that I expected a high standard of devotion from the divine casters in my game, as the church was central to society, and hegemony was as much a source of divine power as individual devotion. Other players were sick of being treated like his sidekicks, and subjected to 5-minute long non-skippable cutscenes and Sailor Moon transformation sequences every time his initiative number came up. So, as a DM, I love when players do this sort of thing. Not in the way Sparkles is doing it, of course, but I love when players take the time to describe their own actions. It flavors their character's deeds in a way that's perfect for them. It makes my job as a DM easier, since now I don't have to take time to describe what they're doing. But it also does wonders for player engagement. It means the world to me as a DM when my players take the time to get invested in their own characters, and by coincidence, the world I made for them. But, and this is a really big but, it needs to be done in moderation. It's one thing to be immersed. It's another thing entirely to dominate a game table. I mean it when I say that nearly every aspect of D&D is a team game, including roleplay. The main takeaway is if you're going to describe your own actions and immerse yourself in the world, that can be a great thing. Just be sure you stay mindful of the other players and don't hog any spotlights. Or you could be the subject of an episode of Den of the Drake. There were other problems too. I had told all of my players to expect a mature game, grounded in gritty medieval history, with unflinching depictions and critiques of privilege and inequality. The latter was designed to goad my players into fighting against injustice, while the former was enforced to enhance the roleplay, to remind them that they were fighting against injustices of 13th century magical Europe. I wanted them to put aside their modern eyes and see what goodness they could eke out without falling into the toxic tropes of social media justice, or the usual triggering depictions of modern inequality superimposed on top of castles and maidens. I had only 2 exceptions. Absolutely no sexual assault in-game or in characters' backstories, and anything that was triggering to anyone would be removed immediately. For Sparkles, however, nuance was an undiscovered country, given how obsessed he was with rules and math. Maybe I should have expected as much. For him, everything was a purity test, and content in a fantasy game was dependent on what he was willing to put up with, giving the privilege of controlling everything that he was exposed to. It first popped up when an NPC, Indy's mentor and direct superior, made a homophobic pun about a bundle of sticks. This was written to highlight how the NPC was from an out-of-touch generation, and to make the players think about how and when to pick their battles. Sparkles brought the game to a grinding halt, as he demanded that word, which he explained he had been called before, never be used in his presence again. I accepted his request without question. I had also been called the word, as had anyone who attended public school, but it's not for me to question anyone else's trauma just because mine credits me with a thick skin when it comes to words. But soon afterward, it was another word, simply because he had seen it used in a negative light. And then another, and another. Nothing was immune to the purity test, and it seemed as if a Tumblr copy pasta, and not actual sociology, was the sole judge in the never-ending prosecution. He would also metagame in the most manipulative way. It was a sliding scale of metagaming. If he were just role-playing, he would just stay as harmless Dr. Jekyll. Unless he wasn't in the scene, then he would just happen to head on over to involve himself and take over. But if dice were involved, he would drop the charade. He would start calculating probabilities, and you could almost hear the gears in his head turning as he tried to think of in-character reasons to act in the optimal manner. But at least he was trying. But once combat started, it was like playing any generic turn-based video game with the RPG tag. Nothing mattered except action economy. And he fully utilized his encyclopedic knowledge of every monster's stat block to his advantage. To avoid the perception of metagaming, if there was something he knew he could optimize but his character might not know, he'd ask to make a roll to know it specifically. If he failed the roll, he would announce, "I guess my character doesn't know how to use radiant damage," to the table pointedly, trying to get someone else to step up. It was like he physically couldn't help himself. But if he ever felt threatened with defeat, or a monster or NPC got one over on him in any way, he went full Mr. Hyde, pulling out every exploit and fighting as dirty as he could to revenge against the slight against his perfect, sparkly self. Additionally, as I became more confident in 5th edition, I became more aware of how he bent the rules to suit himself. Sure, there was the obvious exploiting my naivete to combine 3 different sorcerer archetypes into one clay monstrosity. But then there was the misrepresentation of the action economy, claiming, for example, that as long as initiative was not rolled, he could cast several spells at once before an NPC could react. Saying he was taking the defense action in the same turn, as he had already took an action, asserting that an arcane focus could replace any somatic components of a spell so he could fight with a sword and shield while casting spells without losing any AC. Convenient misrepresentation of homebrew content as being from official books I didn't own, so his power could continue to grow. One thing stayed constant. His hand was always out, asking for more. More options, more abilities, more time center stage, more control. Most of all, more explanations as to why, actually, he wasn't asking for much. After all, it's just what my character would do. Ah, the infamous phrase, "It's just what my character would do." If you've had much experience on D&D forums, you have definitely heard this phrase before. But for those who haven't, this phrase has become famous for being the fastest way to identify a that guy at the table. It can be applied to any situation where the problem player wants to try and shirk responsibility. Burn down an orphanage? Ah, it's what my character would do. Stole from the party? Ah, it's what my character would do. Killed the shopkeeper? Ah, it's what my character would do. Refusing to do the main quest because your paladin is too dedicated to their god to dare associate with the party's rogue? Ah, it's what my character would do. Okay, you all get it at this point. There's actually a very simple solution to dealing with this problem. Are you ready? Stop making characters that do those things. People who use this excuse always act like it's some crazy thing that was always out of their control, then conveniently forget that they are the one who determined every aspect of that character. Like, so many problems could be avoided if people would just focus on making characters that weren't total dickheads. But what was most galling to me is how he would try to control everything. Don't get me wrong, all those red flags I have described thus far are symptoms of a controlling personality. But he would take advantage of the other players' fairly passive personalities to lead the conversation with every NPC, to decide the party's course of action at every turn, to debrief players on every scene, to make every battle strategy. Even when I talked to him and he agreed to pull his head in, it would go something like this. Say a player was facing down a tough combat turn, staring at their character sheet deciding what to do. Then he would say, "But if you move here and cast this spell, you could catch them all in that spell. And even if you go down next turn, I can use Healing Word and we won't lose any momentum. But you do what you want, I'll just shut up now." Spoiler alert, he only shut up until the next player's initiative. It got so bad that I came to realize that every game was just me talking to him for 4 hours, with him occasionally prompting other players to take their turn. To his credit, it was a clever game he played, finding the exact line to walk where he stayed in control at all times, while knowing just how much screen time to give the other players so no one would complain about his behavior. The funny thing was, I think he really believed that he was a team player. So what did I do? Well, I tried to nip it in the bud early, as soon as the complaints about his behavior started rolling in, roughly the exact moment he multiclassed into his stupid sorcerer build. I took him aside and I talked to him. He was very slippery with words, and for every step back I asked him to take, he argued for a step forward compromise. When he didn't stop, I took more extreme action. I took away his magic, as he had done nothing but disrespect his oath and duties as a paladin, and I ruled that his divine soul sorcerer powers came from the same source. He didn't like this one bit, but I could see that he didn't want to let me know it. So he humbled himself, and he became a visibly better player. I was happy, so I brought in the second stage of my plan. I had to find him a new god and a new oath that better suited what he wanted. It was a challenge to arrange this, as he kept asking for more. More freedom, less responsibilities, blah blah blah. We never really nailed down his exact oath outside of the material benefits it gave him in in-game math, of course. But after an epic self-discovery quest, he got his powers back. Minus the spells that let him boost his AC to 27, of course. Then the virus hit, and in a way we were all willing to put up with his garbage because our priorities were shifted. We were just happy to be playing at all, and when I was only seeing names on a Discord server, it was easy to forget that certain players barely spoke at all. The stories we told were just as engaging, and to my players' credit, they stayed engaged and adapted to playing in the background. They all got very good at having their side games and wandering off on diversions until they were fetched by Sparkles. I wrote more stories to include them center stage, but as Sparkles' power grew, so did his ability to follow them invisibly or cast sending right in the middle of their scenes, so he was never fully off stage. Remember when I said that I would keep this story relatively brief? Well, that was a simpler time. Now we enter the second part of this story, the final 2 sessions that resulted in Sparkles being kicked, also known as the final straw. The party was in Candlekeep, which was under siege by a drow army. Willing to sacrifice everything to protect their sacred books, the monks of Candlekeep had accepted the help of a vampire, who raised any casualties on either side as undead to protect the library. So the harder the drow fought to take the fortress, the stronger its defenses grew. Meanwhile, Bernie the sorcerer had an adorable romance side plot with a cinder hag. I was leading Sparkles to a big reveal that the head of the drow army was his long-lost brother, disfigured by chaos magic. Stabby the rogue was being blackmailed by a powerful drow wizard who had infiltrated the keep to undermine their defenses. At the same time, a Fey adventuring party, including Bernie's girlfriend, that had also been caught up in the siege, was viciously pranking Indy the elf paladin. One of their number had been traumatized by an elf, and was goading the others into helping her take it out on the PC. I had hoped that, given Sparkle's tendency to viciously prank any NPC he didn't like, this would stimulate a fun prank war between the two parties. Perhaps because it didn't target him, or perhaps he liked debriefing Indy after every prank, Sparkles never took the bait. Other than that, everything was going nicely. Stabby came up with a genius plan to communicate to Sparkles that he was being blackmailed without the drow being able to scry on him. So Sparkles came up with one of his signature plans. Mechanically sound, but with little foresight. See, when Stabby met the drow, he was breaking into a house, only to find out that it was the drow's hideout. The location of this house was one of the details Stabby had communicated. Sparkle's plan went like this. They would yell, "FBI, open up!" kick in the door, and with the help of the Fae party, pile on the wizard. The only one who wouldn't be involved would be Stabby, who would be resting under a nearby peach tree so the drow wouldn't get wind of the plan. It never occurred to Sparkles that the drow, a trained spy, would abandon a compromised hideout the moment that Stabby stumbled onto it. So, of course, they found the place empty, and of course, a glyph of warding left behind alerted the wizard to their plan. So just as promised, the drow sent his black cat familiar, who was actually a god of mischief in disguise, who was playing both sides against one another. Long story. To deliver a power word kill spell to the resting rogue. This was all a part of my plan. Once dead, the rogue found himself in a space not unlike purgatory, speaking to the god of mischief himself. The god laid some major plot reveals on him, then offered him 3 choices in cryptic form: to die and never feel pain again, to return to life and suffer, or to leave this plane of existence and travel the cosmos as the god's companion. Obviously, 2 of the 3 choices would have him roll up a new character, so he chose to come back to life. But not before Sparkles interjected that the sending spell can technically contact people even on other planes of existence. So he casted it, and interjected himself into the scene. I let him send his message to not delay the scene any longer, but Stabby decided not to reply. Meanwhile, the Fae and the players found Stabby's body, and I had a really emotional scene planned. I wanted all of the players to have a chance to talk about how much Stabby meant to them, and this would cause the Fae to see the players in a new light, and become more permanent allies. The instigator Fae, Nereid, would express genuine grief over this unfair death, in contrast to the exaggerated whining and bawling that she normally exhibited, and would grow as a person, grieving for the trauma that had ruled her life by proxy. This was a seminal moment in the Candlekeep chapter. But Sparkles was having none of it. Anytime I began to describe any of the Fae reacting, the Nereid had just barely dropped to her knees besides the lifeless Stabby's body, he would loudly and angrily cut me off. "No tears! I won't allow it!" he practically yelled, saying that he grabbed the rogue's body and dragged it to the nearest priest to be raised immediately. I think the fact that Sparkle's own plan had gotten another player killed was too much for him, and that he needed to erase the evidence of the crime as quickly as he could, before his flawless Mary Sue aesthetic could be tarnished. Seeing as I had lost control of the scene to an almost hysterical Mr. Hyde, I begrudgingly skipped forward towards the end. The Centaur Paladin from the Fae party firmly put his hand on Sparkle's shoulder to hold him back for the few seconds I needed to finish the scene. "I push him away," Sparkles interrupted before I can get in another word. Knowing that he was about to start misty-stepping with no components, through one of his sorcerer types that I foolishly let him have, he did this every time anyone barred his way, I carried on quickly. I described how the Zelda-esque fairy that was the healer of the Fae party flew down to the rogue. "What do you think you're doing?" and began to sprinkle fairy dust on him. "Tell me right now what you're doing!" Clearly, Sparkles was too amped up to let me give the scene the drama it was worth. So I just go, Stabby comes back to life and the fairy drops to the ground from using all her power. The satyr, the Fae's party leader, cradles the fairy in his hands, picking her lightly up and looking down at the confused rogue, saying, "I hope she was right about you. You had better be worth it." "I attack the satyr!" Sparkles then burst into a rant, half in character, half out, about how stupid the Fae were, how much he hated them for wasting the fairy's life when they could literally just go down the street to a cleric, how he hated that more than anything else in the whole world. I literally had to have the centaur grab him and hold him back, yelling, "She's not dead, just exhausted," after Sparkles started punching the satyr with divine smites layered on top. Then, just for good measure, I told Sparkles that I was rolling to see if he had just killed the fairy by accident, seeing as she was in the satyr's hand when Sparkles started attacking. Luckily, the fairy lived, and we ended the game there. No player had spoken a single word through the whole scene, and they all just looked appalled at his behavior. I was contacted by 2 of them after the game, saying how bad they felt for me having to deal with it. Session 2 started with the players getting a much-needed short rest. I had decided that while the Fae had moved past pranking the elf, they now had a new pranking target in mind. I don't need to tell you who that was. I pointed out to the party that the Drow Wizard had already cast his power word kill, and now the clock was ticking to find him and kill him before he could recover his 9th level spell slot. It was time to get revenge for Stabby's momentary death. The game started by introducing Sparkle's brother for the first time, who magically projected himself into Sparkle's dreams, and demanded to know why his aura felt familiar, which activated Candlekeep's magical intruder detection alarms, and they were all woken by church bells ringing in alarm. Then the sound of booted feet in the street, as the vampire protector had declared martial law, while they searched for the location of the intruder, namely, the party's room. Enter the vampire's thrall, who had a serious grudge against the party. The party had tricked the thrall previously, and the vampire had crippled his servant as punishment for weakness in being taken advantage of. So now the thrall, overseeing the search of the party's room, was out for blood. Immediately, Sparkles declared that he was going invisible and running away, leaving the party to their fate. Indy stared at him across the table in disbelief. Luckily, the Fae came to the party's aid, and united they drove off the vampire's thrall, slinging cutting insults after him as he retreated. Then Sparkles reappeared and was promptly punched in the face by the satyr, who then bluntly said, "Apology accepted." Sparkles declared that he was spending a spell slot to avoid the hit, even after I reminded him about the drow, and clarified that the hit did no damage. He spent it anyway, just because he couldn't bear to lose. So I let him have it, with double barrels of pranking Fae illusory chaos. I must admit, it felt good to deliver him everything he had been doing to every authority figure the party had met for the last 12 months. There were clown shoe squeaks when he walked, the sound of a baby crying when he talked, notes stuck to his back, etc., etc. He kept saying out of character that it was great, and that he was having fun, to bring it on, trying to pretend that he could take it as well as he could dish it out. But you could see him getting more and more agitated. So I moved to another scene, to give him time to calm down and think about how he ended up getting a taste of his own medicine. I had the centaur take Indy aside, to have a paladin-to-paladin talk. The centaur expressed deep concerns about the chaotic energy of both parties, and how it was beginning to boil over, and that they were losing time and resources on a stupid prank war, while the drow wizard was still free. He urged Indy to rally her party, as he would do the same, to keep them on track. Then he asked the party's help. After the drow was dealt with, there was a blue dragon attacking their home, revealing the Fae had come to Candlekeep to research how to defeat it, and offered the party a share of its hoard if they helped. Sparkles immediately objected out of character, saying that he didn't like playing with lots of NPCs, but I think you can guess the real reason why he couldn't wait to part ways with the Fae. Hilariously, he also feigned shock to hear the centaur describe Sparkles as the party leader, saying, and I quote, "I only take charge in order to let other people shine." Indy and I shared a withering glance. Then, as soon as the scene was over, Sparkles immediately started wasting all of his spells on frivolous things, which forced a long rest, meaning the drow had his kill spell back. Then he tried to convince the party to abandon Candlekeep to its fate, saying that he wanted to go shopping in Baldur's Gate. The satyr made a heroic speech to convince them to stay and fight, which Sparkles derailed with a moralizing lecture about gender roles after the satyr used the phrase, "fight like men," completely ignoring the fact that he added, "or like women," with a wink. The party took a vote, and of course, they stayed. Then, during the night, Sparkles declared that he wanted to do a solo scene. Of course he did. He went into the satyr's room to talk to him, and I thought, okay, he's finally trying to make peace. Wonderful. But no. He literally rolled a strength check to force his way in through the door when the satyr refused to let him in. I caught him cheating by adding guidance to the roll without declaring that he cast it, because he didn't have the action economy to cast it and still catch the satyr off guard. He then proceeded to talk down to the satyr, whom the player had just woken up, as if Sparkles were the Fae's father or mentor, gently scolding to impart lessons about life. He told the satyr that it was his own fault for not stopping to explain what the fairy was doing, and to learn from his mistakes and to do better next time. He kept trying to catch him out, and one-up him using tricky word games. The satyr was having none of it, replying, "Look, I get it. You're a zealot. You think the world owes you something that has never existed. You never learn to distinguish between enemies and people who don't share your values, and that's okay. Sometimes we need zealots to change the world, but right now I'm going to bed." And that was the end of the session. Normally, D&D is the high point of my week. I'm walking on air for the whole next 2 days afterwards, and I can't wait to play again. But slowly my love had been sapped by Sparkles and the constant power struggle against his compulsions and insecurities. I was spending too much time coming up with math that he couldn't steamroll over, and not enough time coming up with great stories. After this session, I felt nothing but bitterness. I spoke with the other players, and they too were absolutely disgusted. Bernie was angry that he had tried to push her character into scenes that she didn't want to do. Indy was furious about him abandoning the party to the thrall. And a thought began to crystallize in my head. I thought about the game I planned to run. How I was unmistakably clear to all of my players as to what to expect from this game. How much of it I had given away just because one player liked a different sort of game. I tried to remember the last time that we had been able to simply share a joke without being judged through the hyperactive lens of Tumblr dialogue level amateur wokeness. That even after a year, he wasn't willing to give us the benefit of the doubt. How no matter how many times I talked to him, rather than change his behavior, he just got better at hiding it. Better at justifying it, better at gaslighting and woke scolding me into thinking I was the one being unfair. But the thought that pushed me over the edge was this. We had a new player joining the game. Kitty, the detective druid. All of the players said it was fine, except for Sparkles, who had reserved the right to say no. He didn't want the group dynamic to change, and frankly, Kitty has claws. She would have told him where to stick it. I found myself planning out a conversation where I preemptively apologized to Kitty for his behavior, made excuses on his behalf, and saw in my mind's eye her looking at me in disbelief and saying what I already wondered. Why do you put up with it? I realized then and there that I wasn't comfortable bringing a new player into this toxic dynamic. How could I be comfortable subjecting my current players to it? I messaged Sparkles right then and there. I told him best of luck and thanks for the good times, but this wasn't working. Game over. It was tough, especially since him and Stabby were good friends in real life. Sparkles told Stabby that he had no idea why he was kicked, and he never saw it coming, which almost broke my brain as I recalled all the times I told him to pull his head in. I made the decision to kick him, alone. I wanted my players to be able to keep the option to stay friends with him, so I left them out of the decision entirely. I definitely think I could have handled the whole situation better right from day one. It was very disappointing to see myself get played like that, and for so long. I felt awful. I still do. No matter how logical the decision was, emotionally, I was always going to feel like the bad guy. But I learned some valuable lessons. I was reminded of how manipulators work. They are not D&D villains with daggers behind cloaks. They can be people just like me, often victims of bullying and trauma themselves with their own relatable hang-ups and reasonable requests for personal space, with the small caveat that they either choose to become bullies themselves or never knew that life could be lived any other way, who, unable to dominate through the same strength that broke them, get what they want emotionally and socially. Sometimes, rarely, they are just born evil. I don't think Sparkles is a bad person, just immature. We all have our traumas, and it just happens that mine prohibits me from ever playing D&D with anyone like him ever again. I tried, and I failed. There is still awkwardness in my game, but we are adapting. Kitty is learning the game rules and taking to it like a fish to water. The other players are struggling to lead the story as they are so used to being told what to do. For so long, they would just go and play games in the corner of the tavern until they were called and told the plan. Now they have to do everything, and there is still a paralysis of indecision. But I am adapting the game style to meet them halfway. I've started using skill challenges for when they have objectives, but can't figure out how to achieve them, so they can just focus on tangible skills rather than abstract narrative building. I am so proud of them all. Even if they still want to play passively, I have always held that they can play their characters however they want. But I will also play as I please, and my joy and fascination is to watch them grow, to find their voices and to learn to tell their stories rather than just simply be in them. I now find myself telling the story that my life and my trauma has qualified me to tell, the story where things get better once you overcome. End of story. So, other than the melodramatic, maybe some of them are born evil shtick, I found OP to be very relatable in this story. As a DM, it's really hard to kick a player. And just like OP said, even if it's the logical thing to do, emotionally you're still gonna feel like the bad guy. Another thing that I found to be pretty relatable is that we got to see the exact consequences of what hogging the spotlight brings. I can speak from experience because I used to somewhat have this problem when I first started. I was so eager to get into the game and show off my awesome character that I would often forget that everyone else at the table wanted to do the exact same thing. See, one of the greatest skills that a player can learn isn't mastering roleplay or mastering the rules, no. The greatest talent a player can culture is the ability to know when to shut up. Now, before we go, let's go ahead and take a look at this week's Gallery of the Drake. This week's fan art is done by viewer Sophia.Draws.Pictures, and depicts me showing off some of my newest dragon swag. It is said that these magical glasses allow the wearer to see the most cringe-worthy aspects of every creature they come in contact with. Every creature. Including you, the person watching this video right now. I know what you did. Thank you again, Sophia.Draws.Pictures, for submitting your art. If you want to see your artwork featured in Gallery of the Drake, be sure to send it to the email in my About section. Fan art is my favorite part of doing YouTube, and it means the world to me that I can create content that inspires artists like you to create fan art like this. With the story over and artwork displayed, we're gonna go ahead and wrap up the video here. I would like to thank you all for listening, and I hope to see you next time in the Den of the Drake.